We are back with part two of To Kill a Mockingbird. There's going to be a lot more that's going on with this book. We're going to get to the trial, we're going to find out the answers to some of our questions, and we're going to learn a little bit more about what's going on with Boo Radley. Let's get to the reading. Chapter 12. Jim was 12. He was difficult to live with, inconsistent, moody. His appetite was appalling, and he told me so many times to stop pestering him, I consulted Atticus. Reckon he's got a tapeworm? Atticus said no. Jim was growing. I must be patient with him and disturb him as little as possible. This change in Jim had come about in a matter of weeks. Mrs. Dubose was not cold in her grave. Jim had seemed grateful enough for my company when he went to read to her. Overnight, it seemed, Jim had acquired an alien set of values and was trying to impose them on me. Several times he went so far as to tell me what to do. After one altercation, when Jim hollered, "It's time you started being a girl and acting right," I burst into tears and fled to Calpurnia. Once again, we have that idea here of gender roles and how Jim feels that he as a man is supposed to act as opposed to how Scout is supposed to act, and feeling that pressure from society to start conforming. "Don't you fret too much over Mr. Jim," she began. "Mr. Jim?" "Yeah, he's just about Mr. Jim now." "Oh, he ain't that old," I said. "All he needs is somebody to beat him up, and I ain't big enough." "Baby," said Calpurnia, "I just can't help it if Mr. Jim's growing up. He's going to want to be off by himself a lot now, doing whatever boys do, so you just come right on in the kitchen when you feel lonesome. We'll find lots of things to do in here." The beginning of the summer boded well. Jim could do as he pleased. Calpurnia would do until Dill came. She seemed glad to see me when I appeared in the kitchen, and by watching her, I began to think there was some skill involved in being a girl. But summer came, and Dill was not there. I received a letter and a snapshot from him. The letter said he had a new father, his picture was enclosed, and he would have to stay in Meridian because they planned to build a fishing boat. His father was a lawyer like Atticus, only much younger. Dill's new father had a pleasant face, which made me glad Dill had captured him, but I was crushed. Dill concluded by saying he would love me forever and not to worry. He would come get me and marry me as soon as he got enough money together, so please write. The fact that I had a permanent fiancé was little compensation for his absence. I had never thought about it, but summer was Dill by the fish pool, smoking string, Dill's eyes alive with complicated plans to make Boo Radley emerge. Summer was the swiftness with which Dill would reach up and kiss me when Jim was not looking, the longings we sometimes felt each other feel. With him, life was routine. Without him, life was unbearable. I stayed miserable for 2 days. Let's stop here really quick and go to our chapter notes. We have a lot of stuff that we want to enter in. So we'll start over here with our key events. Jim is going through puberty. Scout agrees to help Calpurnia in a kitchen, which, if you think about Scout's earlier relationship with Calpurnia, makes that quite a milestone, because a lot has changed from her previous behavior of fighting with Calpurnia all the time. So now she is starting to see Calpurnia as more of a person and less of just an adult figure who's just there to make her life miserable. Life's always interesting when that happens. We also have Dill is not coming to make him. As if that were not enough, the state legislature was called into emergency session, and Atticus left us for 2 weeks. The governor was eager to scrape a few barnacles off the ship of state. There were sit-down strikes in Birmingham, bread lines in the cities grew longer, people in the country grew poorer. These were events remote from the world of Jim and me. From here, we can kind of tell that the Great Depression is worsening and that things are not going as smoothly outside the city as Scout imagines. So she's not quite as aware of the wider world yet, but she is a little aware of how people are and how the world is changing. We were surprised one morning to see a cartoon in the Montgomery Advertiser above a caption, Makeham's Finch. It showed Atticus barefooted and in short pants, chained to a desk. He was diligently writing on a slate while some frivolous looking girls yelled, Yoo-hoo! At him. That's a compliment, explained Jim. He spends his time doing things that wouldn't get done if nobody did them. Is there more to that cartoon, or is it as Jim explains it? Well, that kind of changes with your interpretation. But it's interesting to think about. It's kind of our window into the idea that Atticus, there might be more going on to his life than the children imagine. Or it could be just as Jim explains it. Huh? In addition to Jim's newly developed characteristics, he had acquired a maddening air of wisdom. Oh, Scout, it's like reorganizing the tax system of the counties and things. And kind of thing's pretty dry to most men. Well, how do you know? Oh, go on and leave me alone. I'm reading the paper. Jim got his wish. I departed for the kitchen. While she was shelling peas, Calpurnia suddenly said, What am I going to do with y'all's church this Sunday? Nothing, I reckon. Atticus left his collection. Calpurnia's eyes narrowed, and I could tell what was going through her mind. Cal, I said, you know we'll behave. We haven't done anything in church in years. Calpurnia evidently remembered a rainy Sunday when we were both fatherless and teacherless. Left to its own devices, the class tied Eunice Ann Simpson to a chair and placed her in the furnace room. We forgot her, trooped upstairs to church, and were listening quietly to the sermon when a dreadful banging issued from the radiator pipes, persisting until someone investigated and brought forth Eunice Ann, saying she didn't want to play Shadrach anymore. Jim Finch said she wouldn't get burnt if she had enough faith, but it was hot down there. Let's pull up this word if you're unfamiliar with it. Shadrach, a story from the book of Daniel. So there's our biblical reference. So here we are. We have these three men from the Bible, from the book of Daniel, who were thrown into the fiery furnace by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, when they refused to bow down to the king's image because of the divine edict that there should be no bowing down to images beyond Yahweh. They were playing Shadrach and tied this girl in the furnace room. Besides, Cal, this isn't the first time Atticus has left us, I protested. Yeah, but he makes certain your teacher's going to be there. I didn't hear him say this time. Reckon he forgot it. Calpurnia scratched her head. Suddenly she smiled. Well, how'd you and Mr. Jim like to come to the church with me tomorrow? Really? How about it? Grinned Calpurnia. If Calpurnia ever bathed me roughly before, it was nothing compared to her supervision of that Saturday night's routine. She made me soap all over twice, drew fresh water in the tub for each rinse. She stuck my head in the basin and washed it with Octagon soap and Castile. She had trusted Jim for years, but that night she invaded his privacy and provoked an outburst. Can't anybody take a bath in this house without the whole family looking? Let's add in some notes. Atticus is hard at work for the legislature. Kids are left without supervision, and Calpurnia won't let them go to church alone, which brings us over here to our key events. Kids are going to church with Calpurnia. This is an interesting development because at the time, churches were almost exclusively segregated. So the kids would not have had much of a chance to be involved in the black community, especially without white chaperones, especially without adults kind of leaning over them. So they are going to go and get their first glimpse into the way that other people in this community live. Next morning, she began earlier than usual to go over our clothes. When Calpurnia stayed overnight with us, she slept on a folding cot in the kitchen. That morning, it was covered with our Sunday habiliments. We have a vocabulary word to add, finally, habiliment, an archaic word for clothing. She had put so much starch in my dress it came up like a tent when I sat down. She made me wear a petticoat and she wrapped a pink sash tightly around my waist. She went over my patent leather shoes with a cold biscuit until she saw her face in them. It's like we were going to Mardi Gras, said Jim. What's all this for, Cal? I don't want anybody saying I don't look after my children, she muttered. Mr. Jim, you absolutely can't wear that tie with that suit. It's green. What's the matter with that? Suit's blue, can't you tell? I howled. Jim's colorblind. His face flushed angrily, but Calpurnia said, Now y'all quit that. You're going to go to First Purchase with smiles on your faces. First Purchase African M.E. Church was in the quarters outside the southern town limits, across the old sawmill tracks. It was an ancient, paint-peeled frame building, the only church in Macon with a steeple and bell, called First Purchase because it was paid for from the first earnings of freed slaves. Negroes worshipped in it on Sundays, and white men gambled in it on weekdays. So again, here we have an idea of the view of what's important to the black community and how the white community treats it. The churchyard was brick-hard clay, as was the cemetery beside it. If someone died during a dry spell, the body was covered in chunks of ice until rain softened the earth. A few graves in the cemetery were marked with crumbling tombstones. Newer ones were outlined with brightly colored glass and broken Coca-Cola bottles. Lightning rods guarding some of the graves denoted dead who rested uneasily. Stumps of burned-out candles stood at the heads of infant graves. It was a happy cemetery. It's an interesting way of putting it, that the cemetery littered with broken bottles, burnt-out candles, infant graves, lightning rods for those who died violently. It's a happy cemetery. A warm, bittersweet smell of clean Negro welcomed us as we entered the churchyard. Hearts of Love hairdressing mingled with asafoetida, snuff, Hoyt's cologne, Brown's mule, peppermint, and lilac talcum. When they saw Jim and me with Calpurnia, the men stepped back and took off their hats. The women crossed their arms at their waist, weekday gestures of respectful attention. They parted and made a small pathway to the church door for us. Calpurnia walked between Jim and me, responding to the greetings of her brightly clad neighbors. Here we see that idea that if there's white people in the midst of the black people at this point, you are supposed to treat them with deference. You have to behave in certain ways. And if we look at the kind of things that were going on at the South and clear up until even more recent times through civil rights, looking at things like Emmett Till and any number of other things, including in the 90s, James Byrd, you can see that there was a lot of risk if you were African American to the idea that you might be disrespectful to even a child. So they are all acting different. They're showing deference to these white children. And we'll see in a minute how they actually feel about this. The place that they are supposed to be able to be themselves and be more comfortable and not have to put on a show for somebody, and what happens when somebody shows up to ruin that. What you up to, Miss Cal? Said a voice behind us. Calpurnia's hands went to our shoulders, and we stopped and looked around. Standing in the path before us was a tall Negro woman. Her weight was on one leg. She rested her left elbow on the curve of her hip, pointing at us with upturned palm. She was bullet-headed with strange almond-shaped eyes, straight nose, and an Indian bow mouth. She seemed 7 feet high. I felt Calpurnia's hand dig into my shoulder. "What you want, Lula?" she asked, in tones I had never heard her use. She spoke quietly, contemptuously. Let's pull up this vocabulary word here, contemptuously, or contemptuous. Contemptuously, in a scornful way that shows disdain. I want to know why you bringing white chillin' to the nigger church. I feel like I should take this time to point out I'm obviously not a voice actor, but I'm definitely not comfortable with doing a stereotypical early 20th century African American accent. It's kind of gets really close to vocal blackface, so I'm gonna just kind of do this in my own voice. "They's my company," said Calpurnia. Again, I thought her voice strange. She was talking like the rest of them. "Yeah, and I reckon you's company at the Finch House during the week." There are a couple of different ways that we can take this statement. We can view it as aspersions on Calpurnia and Atticus's relationship. We can view it as, oh, they're your company, so we should treat them the same way that white people view us. There are any number of ways we can look at this, and any number of them could color the way that this conversation goes. A murmur ran through the crowd. "Don't you fret," Calpurnia whispered to me, but the roses on her hat trembled indignantly. When Lula came up the pathway towards us, Calpurnia said, "Stop right there, nigger." Lula stopped, but she said, "You ain't got no business bringing white children here. They got their church and we got ours. It's our church, ain't it, Miss Cal?" Calpurnia said, "It's the same God, ain't it?" Jim said, "Let's go home, Cal. They don't want us here." I agreed they did not want us here. I sensed, rather than saw, that we were being advanced upon. They seemed to be drawing closer to us, but when I looked up at Calpurnia, there was amusement in her eyes. When I looked down the pathway again, Lula was gone. In her place was a solid mass of colored people. One of them stepped from the crowd. It was Zebo, the garbage collector. So again, we mentioned that earlier within the chapter with the mad dog, that Zebo was going to be a character that's recurring. "Mr. Jim," he said, "we're mighty glad to have y'all here. Don't pay no attention to Lula. She's contentious because Reverend Sykes threatened to church her. She's a troublemaker from way back, got fancy ideas and haughty ways. We're mighty glad to have y'all." Let's add this here into our notes. Kids get a mixed reception at the church. With that, Calpurnia led us to the church door, where we were greeted by Reverend Sykes, who led us to the front pew. First Purchase was unsealed and unpainted within. Along its walls, unlighted kerosene lamps hung on brass brackets. Pine benches served as pews. Behind the rough oak pulpit, a faded pink silk banner proclaimed, "God is love." The church's only decoration, except a rotogravure print of Hunt's The Light of the World. There was no sign of a piano, organ, hymn book, church programs, the familiar ecclesiastical impedimenta we saw every Sunday. Boy, we've got a lot of stuff here. So let's jump over to our search. Look up a couple things first. First, rotogravure. System of printing using a rotary press with intaglio cylinders, typically running at high speed and used for long prints, runs of magazines and stamps. Okay, this is a print that's run through a cylinder, kind of like a rolling pin. So it's not hand painted or anything. But let's look at the painting and see what it actually looks like. So we have the light of the world here Jesus standing with his fingers outstretched, the moon behind him wearing the crown of thorns. So, looking at this, we get an idea of what is on their wall. Let's look up, though, the vocabulary for ecclesiastical. So relating to the Christian church or the clergy. We'll add that here under our vocabulary. Relating to the Christian church. It was dim inside, with a damp coolness slowly dispelled by the gathering congregation. At each seat was a cheap cardboard fan bearing a garish Garden of Gethsemane, courtesy of Tyndall's Hardware Company. You name it, we sell it. Calpurnia motioned Jim and me to the end of the row and placed herself between us. She fished in her purse, drew out a handkerchief, and untied the hard wad of change in its corner. She gave a dime to me and a dime to Jim. "We've got ours," he whispered. "You keep it." Calpurnia said, "You're my company." Jim's face showed brief indecision on the ethics of withholding his own dime, but his innate courtesy won, and he shifted his dime to his pocket. I did likewise with no qualms. Let's pull this up and then we'll add to our notes. Qualm. An uneasy feeling of doubt, worry, or fear, especially about one's own conduct. So if you ever feel anxious about your behavior and whether you're fitting in, qualm is the word for that. Anxious feeling about your behavior. We have a question here that I want us to think about. Why did Calpurnia give the kids money instead of letting them use their own? "Cal," I whispered, "where are the hymn books?" "We don't have any," she said. "Well, how?" "Shh," she said. Reverend Sykes was standing behind the pulpit, staring the congregation to silence. He was a short, stocky man in a black suit, black tie, white shirt, and a gold watch chain that glinted in the light from the frosted windows. He said, "Brethren and sisters, we are particularly glad to have the company with us this morning. Mr. and Miss Finch, you all know their father. Before I begin, I will read some announcements." Reverend Sykes shuffled his papers, chose one, and held it at arm's length. "The Missionary Society meets in the home of Sister Annette Reeves next Tuesday. Bring your sewing." He read another paper. "You all know of Brother Tom Robinson's trouble. He has been a faithful member of First Purchase since he was a boy. The collection taken up today and for the next 3 Sundays will go to Helen, his wife, to help her out at home." I punched Jim. "That's the Tom Atticus's Shh." I turned to Calpurnia, but was hushed before I opened my mouth. Subdued, I fixed my attention upon Reverend Sykes, who seemed to be waiting for me to settle down. "Will the music superintendent lead us in the first hymn?" he said. Zebo rose from his pew and walked down the center aisle, stopping in front of us and facing the congregation. He was carrying a battered hymn book. He opened it and said, "We'll sing number 273. This was too much for me. "How are we going to sing it if there ain't any hymn books?" Calpurnia smiled. "Hush, baby," she whispered. "You'll see in a minute." Zebo cleared his throat and read in a voice like the rumble of distant artillery. "There's a land beyond the river." Miraculously, on pitch, 100 voices sang out Zebo's words. The last syllable, held to a husky hum, was followed by Zebo saying, "That we call the sweet forever." Music again swelled around us. The last note lingered, and Zebo met it with the next line, "And we only reach that shore by faith's decree." The congregation hesitated. Zebo repeated the line carefully, and it was sung. At the chorus, Zebo closed the book, a signal for the congregation to proceed without his help. On the dying notes of Jubilee, Zebo said, "In that far-off sweet forever, just beyond the shining river, Line for line, voices followed in simple harmony till the hymn ended in a melancholy murmur. I looked at Jim, who was looking at Zebo from the corners of his eyes. I didn't believe it either, but we'd both heard it. Reverend Sykes then called on the Lord to bless the sick and the suffering, a procedure no different from our church practice, except Reverend Sykes directed the deity's attention to several specific cases. His sermon was a forthright denunciation of sin, an austere declaration of the motto on the wall behind him. He warned his flock against the evils of heady brews, gambling, and strange women. Bootleggers caused enough trouble in the quarters, but women were worse. Again, as I had often met in my own church, I was confronted with the impurity of women doctrine that seemed to preoccupy all clergymen. Let's pull up this word and add it to our vocabulary. Austere, severe or strict in manner, attitude, or appearance. We also see here one of those early tenets of the church that some faiths still hold very close to, the idea that in Genesis, women caused the downfall of men and there are all sorts of trouble. This shows us yet again that idea of gender roles and where is your place, not only within home, within society, but within faith. Jim and I had heard the same sermon Sunday after Sunday with only one exception. Reverend Sykes used his pulpit more freely to express his views on individual lapses from grace. Jim Hardy had been absent from church for 5 Sundays, and he wasn't sick. Constance Jackson had better watch her ways. She was in grave danger for quarreling with her neighbors. She had erected the only spite fence in the history of the quarters. A spite fence, if you're unfamiliar, is the idea that I'm going to put up a fence just specifically so that I don't have to look at you. Reverend Sykes closed his sermon. He stood beside a table in front of the pulpit and requested the morning offering, a proceeding that was strange to Jim and me. One by one, the congregation came forward and dropped nickels and dimes into a black enameled coffee can. Jim and I followed suit and received a soft, thank you, as our dimes clinked. To our amazement, Reverend Sykes emptied the can into the table and raked the coins into his hand. He straightened up and said, "This is not enough. We must have $10. The congregation stirred. "You all know what it's for. Helen can't leave those children to work while Tom's in jail. If everybody gives one more dime, we'll have it." Reverend Sykes waved his hand and called to somebody in the back of the church. "Alex, shut the doors. Nobody leaves here till we have $10. Calpurnia scratched in her handbag and brought forth a battered leather coin purse. "Now, Cal," Jim whispered, when she handed him a shiny quarter. "We can put ours in. Give me your dime, Scout." The church was becoming stuffy, and it occurred to me that Reverend Sykes intended to sweat the amount due out of his flock. Fans crackled, feet shuffled, tobacco chewers were in agony. Reverend Sykes startled me by saying sternly, "Carlo Richardson, I haven't seen you up this aisle yet." A thin man in khaki pants came up the aisle and deposited a coin. The congregation murmured approval. Reverend Sykes then said, "I want all of you with no children to make a sacrifice and give one more dime apiece. Then we'll have it." Slowly, painfully, the $10 was collected. The door was opened and the gust of warm air revived us. Zebo lined on Jordan's stormy banks, and the church was over. I wanted to stay and explore, but Calpurnia propelled me up the aisle ahead of her. At the church door, while she paused to talk with Zebo and his family, Jim and I chatted with Reverend Sykes. I was bursting with questions, but I decided I would wait and let Calpurnia answer them. We're going to go toss this over here into our notes. Church is collecting money for Tom Robinson. "We were specifically glad to have you all here," said Reverend Sykes. "This church has no better friend than your daddy." My curiosity burst. "Why were y'all taking up collection for Tom Robinson's wife?" "Didn't you hear why?" asked Reverend Sykes. "Helen's got 3 little ones and she can't go out to work." "Why can't she take 'em with her, Reverend?" I asked. It was customary for field Negroes with tiny children to deposit them in whatever shade there was while their parents worked. Usually, the babies sat in the shade between two rows of cotton. Those unable to sit were strapped papoose style on their mothers' backs or resided in extra cotton bags. Here we see, even though the Civil War is over and slavery has been abolished, we still have that very similar system set up where African Americans were still expected to be working in the fields and harvesting cotton. So that's an interesting insight into something that Scout thinks is normal, but for us in hopefully more enlightened times, we kind of notice that despite the fact that the Civil War was over, things haven't changed as much as we might like. Reverend Sykes hesitated. Well, to tell you the truth, Miss Jean Louise, Helen's finding it hard to get work these days. When it's picking time, I think Mr. Link Dees will take her. Why not, Reverend? Before he could answer, I felt Calpurnia's hand on my shoulder. At its pressure, I said, We thank you for letting us come. Jim echoed me, and we made our way homeward. Cal, I know Tom Robinson's in jail, and he done something awful, but why won't folks hire Helen? I asked. Calpurnia, in her navy voile dress and a tub of a hat, walked between Jim and me. It's because of what folks say Tom's done, she said. Folks aren't anxious to have anything to do with any of his family. Well, just what did he do, Cal? Calpurnia sighed. Old Mr. Bob Yule accused him of raping his girl and had him arrested and put into jail. Mr. Yule? My memory stirred. Does he have anything to do with those Yules that come every first day of school and then go home? Why, Atticus said they were absolute trash. I never heard Atticus talk about folks the way he talked about the Yules. He said, Yes, those are the ones. Well, if everyone in Macomb knows what kind of folks the Yules are, they'd be glad to hire Helen. What's rape, Cal? It's something you'll have to ask Mr. Finch about, she said. He can explain it better than I can. Y'all hungry? The Reverend took a long time unwinding this morning. He's not usually so tedious. Before we continue, I want to point this out. Scout is asking that important question. If everybody knows how the Yules are, their reputations, what kind of people they are, why are they taking their side over this black man who's been accused of a crime? And Scout, as this child, doesn't understand it, but we being older and looking back, especially on this era, the Jim Crow era, we understand exactly what's going on with this. The idea that it doesn't matter how bad you are or how other people perceive you. If you're white, and you are still higher on the social hierarchy than any black person, no matter how revered they are. This is the first time in her life that Scout is kind of being exposed to this idea and really being confronted with what Southern culture at this time looks like. Well, he's just like our preacher, said Jim. But why do y'all sing hymns that way? Lining? She asked. Was that what it is? Yeah, it's called lining. They've done it that way as long as I can remember. Jim said it looked like they could save the collection money for a year and get some hymn books. Calpurnia laughed. Wouldn't do any good, she said. They can't read. Can't read? I asked. All those folks? That's right. Calpurnia nodded. Can't, but about 4 folks in First Purchase read. I'm one of them. Again, here's another way that Scout is being confronted with how her culture, the white culture, is different from this woman who she's known every day of her life. She's never thought to ask about what Calpurnia's life is and how it's different. So she's really being confronted with this idea here. Well, where'd you go to school, Cal? Asked Jim. Nowhere. Let me see now, who taught me my letters? It was Miss Maudie Atkinson's aunt, old Miss Buford. Are you that old? I'm older than Mr. Finch even, Calpurnia grinned. Not sure how much, though. We started remembering one time trying to figure out how old I was. I can't remember back just a few years more than he can, so I'm not much older, when you take off the fact that men can't remember as well as women. What's your birthday, Cal? I just have it on Christmas. It's easier to remember that way. I don't have a real birthday. But Cal, Jim protested, you don't even look near as old as Atticus. Colored folks don't show their age so fast, she said. Well, maybe it's because they can't read, Cal. Did you teach Zebo? Yeah, Mr. Jim, there wasn't a school even when he was a boy. I made him learn, though. Zebo was Calpurnia's eldest son. If I had ever thought about it, I would have known that Calpurnia was at mature years. Zebo had half-grown children, but then I had never thought about it. Well, did you teach him out of a primer like us? I asked. No. I made him get a page of the Bible every day, and there was a book Miss Buford taught me out of. I bet you don't know where I got it, she said. We didn't know. Calpurnia said, Your granddaddy Finch gave it to me. Were you from the Landon? Jim asked. You never told us that. I certainly am, Mr. Jim. Grew up down there between the Buford place and the Landon. I spent all my days working for the Finches or the Bufords. I moved to Macomb when your daddy and your mama married. What was the book, Cal? I asked. Blackstone's Commentaries. Jim was thunderstruck. You mean you taught Zebo out of that? Why, yes, sir, Mr. Jim. Calpurnia timidly put her finger on her mouth. They were the only books I had. Your granddaddy said Mr. Blackstone wrote fine English. Well, that's why you don't talk like the rest of them, said Jim. The rest of who? The rest of the colored folks, Cal. But you talk like they did in church. As Jim is noticing here, Calpurnia is switching between the language that she uses with white people and the language she uses with black people. It's called code switching when we switch the way that we speak depending on who's listening to us. That Calpurnia led a modest double life never dawned on me. The idea that she had a separate existence outside our household was a novel one, to say nothing of her having command of 2 languages. Cal, I asked, why do you talk nigger talk to your folks when you know it's not right? Well, in the first place, I'm black. Well, that doesn't mean you have to talk that way when you know better, said Jim. Here's an interesting concept that is still very pervasive in English today. The idea of, is my language better than your language? And we can go into a long discussion about vernacular and about lingua franca and what kind of language do you have to speak in order to, say, do business and work in a professional work setting. Far more than we can get into here. But when we look at it in the context of this book, it also shows kind of the subconscious bias that Jim and Scout, even as children, have towards black people versus white people. Similar to how Scout behaved with Walter Cunningham when he came home with him and drowned his food in molasses. The idea that other people might live a different way than they do. This is one of the first times that it's really dawning on them that the world is a bigger place than they think. Calpurnia tilted her hat and scratched her head and then pressed her hat down carefully over her ears. That's hard right to say, she said. Suppose you and Scout talk colored folks talk at home. It'd be out of place, wouldn't it? Now, what if I talked white folks talk at church and with my neighbors? They'd think I was putting on airs to beat Moses. But Cal, you know better, I said. It's not necessary to tell all you know. It's not ladylike in the second place. Folks don't like to have somebody around knowing more than they do. It aggravates them. You're not going to change any of them by talking right. They got to want to learn by themselves, and when they don't want to learn, there's nothing you can do but keep your mouth shut or talk their language. Cal, can I come see you sometimes? She looked down at me. See me, honey? You see me every day. Out to your house, I said. Sometime after work, Atticus can get me. Anytime you want to, she said. We'd be glad to have you. We were on the sidewalk by the Radley place. Look on the porch yonder, Jim said. I looked over to the Radley place, expecting to see its phantom occupant sunning himself in the swing. The swing was empty. I mean our porch, said Jim. I looked down to the street. An armored, upright, uncompromising Aunt Alexandra was sitting in the rocking chair exactly as if she had sat there every day of her life. We know who Aunt Alexandra is. We know what kind of person she is. We know how she acted around Francis. So her coming to the Finch house can't be a harbinger of anything good. Let's add some notes, look up some vocab, and then we'll wrap up chapter 12. Let's add some notes here. So we found out today Calpurnia and came from Finch's Landing. We also know Scout is for the first time Scout is for the first time learning that other people have different experiences from her. This might seem like an interesting idea. If you've grown up in a large town, you're probably familiar with the idea that there's a lot of different people out there and the world is a big place. But having spent my first couple of years teaching in a small town and working with kids who have never been out of their state, some of them have never been out of the county, you realize that so many people don't have this idea that there's a bigger world out there beyond just what they know. And the more traveling, the more talking to people, the more learning about other people you do, the more you can learn about what other people go through and their experiences, both good and bad. You can apply that to your own life to make things better or to avoid mistakes. So that's why it's so important not only to take messages from this book, but also to go out there and meet other people and talk to them and learn about them. You can't just sit in your own hometown doing the same thing forever. You're going to miss out on so much of life. And that's one of the things that Scout is learning here for the first time. And something that as the book goes on, we're going to realize that a lot of people don't understand. They don't get, even the older people in our town, the ones that never leave town and never talk to anybody but the same 10 people. There's so much that they don't understand. We are also going to add this in, extremely important. Aunt Alexandra has shown up at the house. We don't know why she's there. We don't know her purpose, but she is there. In chapter 13, we might find our answer.